Hi, I'm Chris Ketzley, Executive Director here at the Association of Towns. Talk of the Towns podcast is a production of the New York State Association of Towns and strives to bring the voices from across New York to talk about all things towns. If you're interested in participating as a guest, please email us at info@nytowns.org. The views and opinions expressed by podcast guests are of their own and do not necessarily reflect the views, positions, or policies of the New York State Association of Towns. Hello, welcome back to another edition of Talk of the Towns, where we talk about all things towns. We have a great topic for you here today, but before we introduce our guests, I just want to remind you that you can get us on YouTube, Spotify, or the Apple platform. Whichever way you listen or watch, please make sure you always do what we ask and hit that like, share, and subscribe button. You subscribe, you're going to get the notifications every time a new podcast episode drops, so you don't miss anything. And of course, sharing and liking helps us spread the word on really all the things we're talking about, which are important to folks in the state of New York, towns. And please make sure you hit those buttons and help us with that. My name is Chris Ketzley. I'm the Executive Director here at the Association of Towns, and today we have a great episode for you. It's going to be one of those episodes, much like our OPEB episode we just released, where it sounds like it's going to be not so interesting, but it is critically important and actually very interesting. We're going to be talking about the SEQR process today, the State Environmental Review Act, or we'll get the actual acronym for you in just a moment, but it is something that is very important to towns, important to communities, and we have one of the experts in the state of New York here with us. We have Andy Brick from Brick Law Firm. Andy, welcome. Thank you very much for being here. I know when we talked about this, you thought that this might not be the most exciting topic, but actually it's a very interesting topic.
And I agree, and I enjoy speaking about SEQR and land use issues in general, so thank you for the opportunity. What I find out there is that local land use boards, planning boards, zoning boards of appeal, even town boards, when they're involved in SEQR, there's a misconception that it's a complicated process, but it can really be explained on simple terms. And when I do trainings, there have been, whenever I say, okay, now we're going to talk about SEQR, which SEQR is the State Environmental Quality Review Act. Some people put an A on the end of it. Some people say SEQR, which is just State Environmental Quality Review. But it's the same thing. It's a state statute, and it requires agencies of local government, all local government boards, to consider potential environmental impacts when they're considering some type of approval or funding that's before the particular agency. So it's been around since, I believe, 1975. I've been involved with it since 1995. I've been practicing just over 30 years now. The first 15 years of my career, I was on the municipal side. I represented local governments primarily. I was the planning board attorney, the zoning board attorney. I represented both downstate and upstate municipalities, towns, cities, and villages for the first 15 years of my career. In 1995, I started in the town of Babylon, down in Suffolk County, which is one of your members. Yes. Great place, great people. Yes. It was a great opportunity for me there.
I hear the Long Island in you, by the way.
Yeah, it comes out, especially when I'm nervous. And since I had to ask my daughter what a podcast is, I'm a little nervous about this. But on my first day in 1995 in the town attorney's office in the town of Babylon, which, as you know, is a large town. It's like 400, 500,000 people. The town attorney came to me about 10 o'clock in the morning. It was a Monday, my first day. And he said, what do you know about planning and zoning? And I said, nothing. I said, actually, planning and zoning, that course was kind of a joke in law school. In law school, you got to pick the courses you wanted by a lottery number. So the running joke was, if you got a bad lottery number, you were going to have to take planning and zoning. So fortunately, I was always in the middle, so I never had to take planning and zoning. So I explained that to him. He said, well, okay, it's a good thing I asked, because you're going to be the planning board attorney, and their meeting is tonight. So I said, this is my first day. I have a meeting tonight. He goes, yeah, well, you have 9 hours to brush up. You'll be fine. And that's how I ended up being a planning and zoning attorney, and I've loved it ever since. I've never looked back. When I left Long Island, I came upstate. I did a brief stint with the Assembly, the Government Operations Committee, as well as a brief stint as counsel to NICOM, the Conference of Mayors, which is your sister organization. So it was there that I really learned and got a good sense of the issues facing local governments and cities and villages. And I interacted primarily with the planning boards and zoning boards and got to know them pretty well. And then went on to represent a bunch of other municipalities. In 2008, I switched over to the private side. And now my practice is a combination of both municipalities and private practice appearing before municipalities. So throughout that time frame, SEQR has always been at the forefront of the things I do, either representing land use boards or now representing applicants before land use boards, but I still do represent a few boards. So SEQR has always been there. And again, when I see people, when I say SEQR to people, I can literally see a visceral reaction, almost eyes roll. But it doesn't have to be that way. I recently was at a conference, and I said to the audience, I can teach you SEQR in 2 minutes. And of course, they took that as a challenge. So I said, look, it's a very simple process. It sits on top of your local requirements. So if you have a subdivision law, if you have a site plan law, you have a special use permit law, SEQR doesn't alter those. It sits on top of it and runs a parallel course. And it's basically 4 steps. And people get turned around by the language utilized and the terminology, which is one of the suggestions I would have on how we can improve the SEQR process and local government's interaction with it. But it's basically the local agency, if they have something before them that they're either going to approve or fund, they have to consider the SEQR process. And the first question they ask is, are we the appropriate board to act as the lead agency under SEQR? SEQR requires one board to take the lead and do the environmental review.
I want to pause there for a moment because
Sure.
I want to talk a little bit about the board and,
Sure.
and organization and structure. Before we get to that, full disclosure, Andy and I have worked together in different capacities in the town of Glenville over the years. So,
Yes.
Andy, you've come in my time in Glenville and represented the developer.
Correct.
In I think more than one developer. Yeah. So I always knew of Andy and always had great respect for him. And then secondly, now, since I've left, Andy's been hired to be the counsel to the planning board in the town of Glenville, and I understand doing a wonderful job, so thank you for your service there.
And in the interest of full disclosure, I didn't always get my way when you were supervisor. There were a few times where you said no, it wasn't in the best interest of the town, which...
I was tough on people tell me I was a little tough on developers, I guess. But
yeah, but
yeah.
That's what you have to do as an elected official. So you're always fair to me.
Yeah.
You're always candid with me, and I appreciated it. But
yeah, I think that's key, and we'll get into maybe that later about how important it is for local governments just to be candid with the applicant. A lot of times I know applicants come in and they get strung along because people don't want to say no or they don't want to upset anybody, and you know, time is money. Yeah. and all those types of things. And so I always appreciated that. I appreciate developers, and we actually did a lot of business in Glenville, but the prism always was, as an elected official, so many of you I know have the same responsibility. The prism always was what's best for the town, and we always try to figure out how to advance something in the town through a project, sidewalks that were built or the public benefit stuff. And so that's all great opportunities for local governments to get some stuff in their community. But as far as trying to just explain to folks how this works, you know, as far as organizationally and structure, because everyone knows about the town board, but, you know, let's talk a little bit about how the town board appoints, how the planning board, what their responsibilities are, how they're appointed, what their terms are.
Sure.
All those types of things. Yeah.
So most towns at this point in time have a planning board. I don't think all of them do. You'll still find some towns, particularly in upstate, that don't have a planning board, but most do. And a planning board is a separate board. They're not elected officials. The elected officials are the supervisor and the town board. If they create a planning board, the town board appoints local citizens to the planning board. And as part of the local town code, they give certain powers and duties to the planning board. The most common are subdivision review. Somebody wants to come in and subdivide their 10-acre parcel into 10 building lots and build 10 houses. It goes to the planning board. Or site plan review. A CVS or a Chipotle or somebody wants to go build a store or a restaurant on a corner, then that's site plan review. It's more commercial related than the residential. The planning board, they're usually between 5 and 7 members. They all have to be local residents. There's no specific expertise required other than having a knowledge of your community and a love of your community. Some planning boards will find people that have some backgrounds that assist in serving as a planning board member, but it's not required. And then the planning board will engage in the reviews that are given to it, so subdivision review. What the Environmental Quality Review Act requires is that while they are engaged in that review, they also have to review that application for any potential adverse impacts to the local or larger environment. So that's how SEQR, as I say, kind of sits on top of the underlying local review process. And planning board members are tasked with engaging in SEQR review. And in my experience, it's definitely gotten better in the last 20 years, but there has been a lack of consistent understanding of what SEQR requires. And board members are appointed for the number of years that there are members. So if there's 5 members, you get a 5-year term. So in 5 or 7 years on the board, people will gain a knowledge of SEQR just by constant repetition of going through the process. But so newer members really don't necessarily have a good grasp of it. And the way the SEQR regulations and the process is worded, in my opinion, is unduly complicated. And that's what confuses people. And when it confuses the board members, they get turned off to the process. And that's what I see whenever I say I want to talk about SEQR. And the confusion stems, in my experience, primarily from the terminology. If the terms utilized in the SEQR process would change, it would make much more sense to people. If you're going to ask me how would I change the SEQR process, change the terms. And the most glaring example is SEQR. The process itself ends in either a positive declaration or a negative declaration. And that's what that's the language the regulations use, and that's what's required. The problem with that, though, is a negative declaration is a declaration that there will be no adverse impacts, whereas a positive declaration, use the word positive, which you think is a good thing, means there is a potential for environmental impacts, and it could be a bad thing. So just throwing out those two terms and coming up with ones that are more descriptive of the end result would go a long way in making people feel better about the SEQR process.
I can tell you that when I was supervisor on the town board, anytime we were the lead agency and it was up for the town board to issue a neg or a positive deck or whatever, that was the most confusing thing for the board members to get them to understand what they were voting on.
How am I voting? Yeah,
yes, how am I voting? What
yes.
does this mean, negative?
Right.
They weren't sure because it's completely, you're right, opposite of what, so that is interesting. The planning board, you mentioned 5 or 7, those are the terms they get, but it is staggered so that there's always continuity?
Correct.
Okay.
There's always somebody new coming in. The way it's supposed to set up is a new person every year, and it's staggered, so every year someone goes off and someone comes on. So that means you always have a newbie coming in who may not have any prior experience with the SEQR process or the land use process in general. So there's always a learning curve on the board. And that can be, it's gotten better with the mandatory training. About, 15, 20 years ago, they adopted a 4-hour annual mandatory training for planning board members and zoning board of appeals members. And I've provided that training. I still provide that training for local governments. I'll travel to the local government and they'll put their land use boards together and I'll spend 4 hours giving them their annual training. And I divide the 4 hours up every time, and it seems to be most effective. The first hour is general process stuff, open meetings law, freedom of information law, how to conduct a meeting, public notice, those type of things. The second hour will be talking about subdivision process, site plan review process. The third hour will be SEQR. And I can get through SEQR, and people have told me they've walked away from that training having a better understanding of SEQR from the 1 hour where we talk about it than all the trainings they've gone to. And then the fourth hour is ethics, because people there's a lack there of people understanding what they can and can't do, under attorney general opinions, state control opinions, the code of ethics in the general municipal law. But the SEQR process, I always do it after the 2 hour break because they're captive audience. If I tried to do it second, and then I would lose them because now they're looking at the break because they don't want to listen to it. So I always do it third. I can't do it last because people are putting their coats on. But the process it's overly complicated the way it's explained and the way it's written, but it's not an overly complicated process. And planning board members can get their hands around it if it's explained to them in English. And I think that's the component that's been missing for a number of years. Now, 20 years ago, I was asked to give a presentation, Intro to SEQR, and I entitled my handout, "Here's Everything You're Doing Wrong." And that got nixed by the editorial content. But 20 years ago, it literally was that. I had to go in and say, here's everything you're doing wrong with SEQR. In the last 20 years, it's gotten a lot better. Your local land use boards out there in your towns and villages now have a much better grasp than they did 20 years ago, but it could be improved.
Yes. And, just to plug the association's educational programming, we do have a planning and zoning school as well in the fall, every fall. Maybe that'd be something great for you to come in and maybe present at or teach at. We have courses at the annual meeting, which is every February. This year it's March. So we always try to bring more educational programming around this to our members as well. So maybe we can team up on that.
I'd be happy to. And
That'd be
I
great.
think I would propose to, the title for my presentation would be "Don't Be Afraid of SEQR,"
Yep.
rather than "You're Doing It Wrong," because
Yeah.
there has been improvements over 20 years. But the process itself is not as cumbersome as people make it out to be. There are large projects. Clearly, the size of the project will determine the level of review and the potential for adverse environmental impacts. And the SEQR system is set up to recognize that. So what the state did, and it's continually surprising to me that I'll go to planning boards and they don't even know these exist, but the state created 2 lists in state regulations. They created a list called a Type 2 list and a list called a Type 1 list. And these are the SEQR Type 1, SEQR Type 2. And they're right there in state regulations. I think every planning board member should have them. The Type 2 list are activities or actions or approvals that the state has determined won't likely have any environmental impact, so SEQR is not required for them. So if you find what's in front of you, the subdivision, the site plan, whatever's in front of the board, if you find it meets one of the thresholds in the Type 2 list, then no further SEQR review is required. And people are shocked when I say that, because people thought that they had to go through the entire SEQR process to then say, no, there's no environmental impact, so it's a Type 2 action. That's not the case. You can front end a Type 2 determination and eliminate the need for SEQR further.
What would kick in to make it a Type 1? What are some examples of Type 1?
Type 1 are bigger things. They are larger projects. They are your certain thresholds of number of units. I'm talking 50 to 100 residential units. And there's a tiered approach based upon the size of the municipality. So certain size, 200 plus, for example, in a certain size municipality is a Type 1. But it also then dovetails into whether or not it's connected to water and sewer. So if it's, because it's a recognition that larger things will have larger impacts. It's a Type 1 list. Anything in proximity to a historic site, anything in proximity to a municipal or state park, Those type of things are also thresholds that trigger the type 1. But it's easy, once you know these two lists exist and you have them in front of you, it's easy to look at the application, look at the SEQR form that's required as part of the application, the short environmental assessment form or the long environmental assessment form, and figure out which list you're on. If you're not on either list, you're in the middle, which is what's called an unlisted action. And most 90% of actions out there are unlisted actions. The fundamental difference between type 2, unlisted, and type 1 is type 2, if you find it on the type 2 list, you're done. SEQR's done, it's over. You announce it's type 2 and you move on to review the project and approve or disapprove the project. If it's a type 1, there are presumptions that an environmental impact statement is required. An environmental impact statement is a large document that's prepared by engineers that analyzes all the potential impacts, and it gets presented to the lead agency, and then they review to see if any mitigation is required. It's a complicated process, it's expensive, and it's rare. It's really only for the big projects.
And that's commonly also referred to as the EIS.
EIS,
okay,
correct.
Yes.
And I have, as I said, I've been practicing in the field of land use since 1995. I have been involved in thousands, possibly over 10,000 applications in my career on both sides. You know, at the board meetings, before the boards, as municipal attorney, as a private applicant, thousands. I have been involved in 5 environmental impact statements. So they are exceedingly rare. Now, granted, no one hires me to get a nuclear power plant approved or, you know, something that large. That's the type of thing that would absolutely require an environmental impact statement. But I wrote all of the zoning for the casino and the Mohawk Harbor project in the city of Schenectady, which is a large mixed-use project with a casino. I wrote the zoning and got all of the land use approvals for the casino and the Mohawk Harbor project. That was a type 1 action. It did not require an EIS. We converted a brownfield on a major river into a mixed-use apartment, retail, commercial, office complex, and dropped in a casino, which 6 months prior to that hadn't even been an allowed use in New York State. And we did all of that as a type 1 action, but it didn't trigger an environmental impact statement. So the things I have been involved in an environmental impact statement are of equal size. I got 2,100 residential units approved in partially in the Adirondacks, right on the line in Warren County. And that clearly, in a small town in Warren County, and you're going to propose 2,100 units when there's probably only 2,100 residential units in the town itself, is a type 1 action that would require an environmental impact statement. So that was another example. A major truck distribution center that had rail access, and they wanted to expand, but they needed to relocate a county road. Type 1 action required an environmental impact statement. Those are the type of things. But again, thousands of projects. I've only been involved in 5 of them.
So we're going to come back to the type 1, type 2 discussion once we get into talking about the proposal here in Albany called Let Them Build. I'm sure you've seen some of the billboards and commercials.
Yeah.
We have some thoughts on that. We can talk about the type 1s and type 2s in a little while. The question I had, first of all, a couple things came out of that. I remember when I was at the town and working with Ray Gillen, one of the best economic developers ever that I've ever known. We did a lot of work in our what was called an industrial park, but became known as the Business Technology Park in Glenville. And I recall there being something that was kind of set as an overlay to that. It was like I don't know if it was a GIS.
Yeah.
And so in that case, does that kind of get you, once that's filed and accepted, does that get you around some of the type 1s?
Yes and no. And a GIS is a generic environmental impact statement. And what that is it is a form of environmental impact statement. But the reason it's called generic is because it isn't project specific. Mm-hmm. It will take an area of a municipality, an area of town, such as an industrial park, and it will do an environmental impact statement on all of the potential uses and build outs of that property, and analyze full potential build out. generically, because there is no specific project. And once that the generic environmental impact statement, the GEIS, is accepted by the municipality, then if any underlying project wants to go into the geographic jurisdiction that was the subject of the GEIS, SEQR is already complete.
Okay.
And so rather than going through the entire SEQR process for the project, all the project has to do is demonstrate that their proposal is within the thresholds of potential build that were analyzed. And GEISs are great if they're expensive. So if there's a funding source for them and they put them in place, it's great for the local government, because then the planning board can just review the projects in front of them and don't even have to worry about the secret components of it, because it's already been satisfied.
I remember that was one of the tools that we utilized there to get so much development, and that whole park redeveloped. Having that GIS was critical. So there's something that your community can look into to maybe help try to spur some of these projects. Is doing it doesn't have to be necessarily a one property park or anything. It's just kind of like you look at it from a geographic location. It could be housing, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. So some municipalities, what they do, and I think it's innovative, and I don't tell my clients that I said that, is they will enact a GEIS, because if they enact a GEIS, that gives them the ability to seek mitigation fees from development.
Yes.
There is a very important case from about 30 or 40 years ago which says that local governments, towns, can't require impact fees or off-site improvements as a result of a project. Towns have found a way to not get around that case, but alter what they're doing. If you do a GEIS, and the GEIS, part of the findings are mitigation measures necessary. It comes up a lot in traffic. It says, this is what the cost would be for every trip added to your roadway. So if a project comes in and is going to add 1,000 trips to the roadway, there's a dollar figure as a mitigation cost. It's not an impact fee, it's a mitigation cost. GEISs allow you to do that, and a lot of municipalities have been very effective in doing that.
Folks, if you're listening or watching, mark this moment in the podcast, because that is a great tip and tool for local governments to really figure out, again, not maybe impact, but yes, impact, certainly.
Right.
Finding ways of getting benefits to your community. And we in Glenville did a lot of that, and that was very important in getting some of these, the sidewalks, the pedestrian walkways we were able to get out of some of these projects. Very, very helpful. I wanted to ask you, a while back you said, start talking about, and I interrupted, about what the planning board does in the SEQR process. And one of the things you said was really look at the environmental concerns. So what are some of the examples that a town planning board would be interested in regarding environmental concerns? What are the things they're looking at either in an EIS or in the SEQR process?
Traffic, impacts to local water and sewer systems, impacts to deforestation, clear cutting versus preserving landscaping, impacts transportation, traffic impacts is always a big one, impacts to other existing municipal infrastructure. Is it going to require sidewalks? Those type of things. To a certain degree, aesthetics, visual impacts can be considered as part of the SEQR process. Aesthetic impacts, it's a little vague on how far you can go on, saying what the building has to look like. But most municipalities push the envelope effectively. But though any type, do they look at air pollution? In certain instances, yeah. But air pollution isn't something, a CVS is coming in, or a Chipotle, or a 10-lot subdivision. What are their impacts going to be? And the planning board members on the ground in that community, they have the better sense of what the potential impacts would be in any particular neighborhood or environment than anything the mandatory state forms could reveal by filling out numbers. How many traffic trips, how many gallons of water per day, those type of things. It's the local planning board members. They said, hey, this is going to be right down the street from the school. How is this going to impact bus traffic twice a day? This anything like that. This is just outside of the downtown where there's going to be a gap in the sidewalks. How is it going to affect pedestrian availability, those type of things. There are municipalities that have very important concerns about visual impacts. There are places that have beautiful views that they want to keep. So they don't want the solar farm on top of the hill where everybody sees it, and the glare during the day is going to blind everybody in the town. They want it hidden so it's not seen. So if you propose the solar farm on top of the hill, that gives the planning board the ability to say that's a potential adverse environmental impact, because now you're wrecking our view of the mountain behind it, and we don't want to look at that every day. So there's an adverse environmental impact. The local community members would know that better than DEC or the DEC forms.
Which right there, I don't want to interrupt, but I do want to flag such an important concept for us all, why home rule is so important, why New York State is a home rule state, and why land use should and ought to stay with the local government. And we won't get into the whole ORES stuff on taking on solar in this podcast, but maybe that's a follow-up podcast, because that's a hugely important issue across the state, where they will come in on larger projects. I think 25 megawatts or more.
They took it away.
Just took it away from the local governments, and it's wrong. I think it's in conflict with home rule, constitutional protection of home rule. But that's a whole nother podcast, and you're going to get me going. But I did want to flag how important home rule is into the land use process, and why land use is uniquely local government.
No question. And I, from my time at NICOM, I am a home rule guy. Yeah. I'm a local authority guy, especially with land use. Yeah. As I said, the 7 members on the planning board know better what's best for their community, better than anybody in the DEC regional office, and that's what you want them there for. To take, as an aside, to take away the authority to regulate those large-scale scholars, that's frightening. That is a usurpation of home rule authority, clearly.
Yeah. And we know it's a slippery slope from there. It's not a lot to really go then to, well, let's do 15 megawatts, let's do 10, let's do all of them, Right. And you're the attorney here, you know better than I, but obviously with home rule, there's limits to home rule, because there was this, of state concern that was established in the courts, and it becomes a question of what is a state concern compared to what is a local issue, and that gets a little gray and it gets a little messy, but it's interesting, because I think that there's this proposal that we're going to talk about here in Albany called Let Them Build. We talked about it, and I think as we rush towards this kind of housing crisis and all these other issues we have going on, what's the right answer to that? Is the state, the state's vision of what we should do in housing the right answer, or is it what the local government, what the people in that community want, the right answer? Is it a state concern, or is it a local matter? Right. And I think that's interesting. But in a lot of communities, and correct me or help me understand this just to make sure, there's the SEQR process, and you have your type 1s, your type 2, your unlisted. And then you also have site plan review, right? And that's local law.
Correct.
So what happens, this is what I'm concerned about, the towns that don't have site plan review in their local code primarily rely on SEQR. That's what they use. Mm-hmm. And if we take some of these type 1s, right? No, I'm sorry. I think the governor's suggesting type 2.
Part of the proposal is expanding the type 2 list.
Yes.
Which I'm all for that. Okay. Because if you recall, if you find it on a type 2 list, the local government's review is over. There's a presumption in law, in the regulation, that it will not have an adverse environmental impact. There are approximately 40 things on that list right now. The more they add to that, the better, because that gives the planning board the ability to say, it's already been determined there won't be an adverse environmental impact, so let's focus on the merits of the application and the down and dirty aspects of where are the curb cuts? Is it going to be a right in, right out? Is it going to be a full? The things that really matter to the community. Are we going to need a traffic light to service this new mixed use? Those type of things are site plan review. And those are the things that have the more drastic impact on the individual municipalities, and they can focus on it if SEQR is taken off the table because they already found it was a type 2.
So even if it's moved to type 2, let's say you have a multifamily housing project, it's moved to, and the governor has offered certain limits to this, you know, it has to be a certain size, not too big. The town that has site plan review in their code still has the ability to do a traffic study or a lighting study.
Absolutely.
But if you don't have site plan review in your code, do you then lose that ability to require that in the process?
Yes, if you don't have site plan review and no subdivision is being requested, assuming you have subdivision review, and it's a type 2 action, then it's an as of right project. They can go get a building permit and go build whatever it is they're going to build.
And I think that's a concern. And off the top of my head, I don't know how many towns do not have a site plan, but I have to believe there's a lot of smaller rural towns that do not. And one of the concerns we have with let them build simply is, I think you're right. Let's cut some red tape. Let's figure out how to do some of this stuff easier and let the planning board focus on what they need to focus on. But we have to be mindful, and we've talked to the governor's office about this and some legislators, that a lot of towns don't have that process. So, you know, a housing project, child care facility, these are some of the proposals. Those are very heavy traffic generators. We'll have lighting impacts. We certainly don't want light pollution. We want, you know, respect the dark skies at night. And so for towns to lose that, I'm very concerned. That's one of the major issues that we have with the proposal. And we like it. We like that she's moving in the right direction as far as cutting red tape and helping local governments be more agile. But we also have to make sure we're protecting these communities that don't have a site plan.
Well, the easiest way to solve that, in my opinion, would be expand the type 2 list, put more things on a type 2 list, but then give the local government the ability to choose to take something off of type 2 and analyze it under SEQR. Give them, again, that's local control. That's the local choice. If it's on the type 2 list, and in some municipalities, it's fine because they have site plan review, that's great. In municipalities where they don't have site plan review, but they want some type of review over a large-scale housing project, give them the ability to choose locally to take it off the type 2 and put it into unlisted or type 1 and do a SEQR review.
So I think you're touching on perhaps maybe the presumption of the state here, thinking that local governments have weaponized the SEQR process to avoid certain projects they don't want. Because I think that's a logical solution. It makes sense. But I worry that there's an implication, or there's this implied concept in this let them build that says, oh, it's the local governments that weaponize SEQR. And I don't think that's accurate.
And it's not. To the extent, the SEQR process, if it's weaponized by anybody, it's weaponized by opponents to a project. And this goes to part of the proposal. This goes to the nature of the legal jurisprudence surrounding SEQR review in our courts since it was enacted. And the level of judicial review is stringent when someone makes a SEQR claim. So to the extent SEQR gets weaponized, in my opinion, it's weaponized by opponents of a project, not the municipality. Now, in fairness, if a municipality wants to regulate or restrict the size of projects, they have the power to enact zoning. You know, zoning is the gatekeeper of the size of projects. And from what I've seen in my experience, zoning and NIMBYism have restricted housing development more than the SEQR process itself. I mean, making tweaks to SEQR to get housing projects expedited is marginally effective. It's cutting around the edges. It's not getting to the heart of what is stopping housing projects. And the easiest barrier to housing projects is found in local zoning codes. But local zoning codes, that's your autonomy. That's how you want your municipality to look. Right. No one should Bigfoot the local government and say, you must have this if they've enacted zoning that doesn't allow something at that scale. That's their local government.
Right. And there's obviously legal protections for developers who come in and say want to build something that there's, say, NIMBYism does stop. Let's say that, the masses, the mobs have taken over and have influenced the planning board and the town board and all this stuff. Well, there's always Article 78.
Correct.
That if it isn't a fair determination, there's always that ability for a developer to go back and do. But NIMBYism is a powerful concept. There's no question about it. I remember in my time, anytime there was a housing project, actually, I'm going to tell you what. Anytime there was any project, there was a section of that community against it.
Yeah.
We had to rebuild our town center, which was Route 50, right where Town Hall
Glenridge,
is,
yep.
and when I came in, Kmart just closed. It was empty and dark, and people were complaining nowhere to shop. But even as we brought things in, like Target and Chipotle and other things, people were against that. But it's incumbent on the local government to be fair, as we talked about early, to determine what's best for the community, and to reject some of those NIMBYism arguments that are based on their own personal issues. I like to say, when I was supervisor, the last person who moved into town wants to be the last person who moved into town.
Right.
Anytime.
Right.
It's like, we're not building any more houses now.
Yeah.
We just built my house and that's it.
Yeah.
So, but there's a balance there with the characteristic of the community. And so some of it's fair,
And I agree with you. I represent a lot of home builders. There's 4 types of costs that go into building a new home. There's the acquisition cost, which is acquiring the land. That's supply and demand. Land is valuable in New York. You're not going to change that. There is the approval costs, which the proposed SEQR regulations, again, marginally around the edges, will hopefully reduce the costs to get the approvals for your project, say a subdivision project. Then there are carry costs, and that's the cost to carry the property while you're waiting for your approvals and waiting to build. And they're primarily taxes and insurance. And they are brutal to the developer, and they could easily be reduced by the state if the state chose to. And it's not in a direct manner. Labor Law 240, which I'm sure you're familiar with. Labor Law 240 impacts carry costs because the insurance you have is higher because of Labor Law 240. But then it impacts construction costs while you're constructing, because that's when you actually have the scaffolds. So something like that easily brings down the costs. And the 4th cost is construction cost. There are ways the state could ease construction costs. And the primary reason we don't have enough new housing in this state is construction costs. My guys tell it to me all the time. And how can the state help in things like that? Well, they can reconsider such things as the natural gas ban, where they put the ban in place, which is currently on hold, that says, my guys now can't build and put in natural gas. My guys have to make all electric heating houses. Well, heat pumps only work 9 months a year in this environment. So you have to have additional electric. And the cost to make those all electric houses is cost prohibitive. So things like that, the state could, if they reevaluated their approach and said, okay, construction costs are the primary opponent of new housing. How do we reduce them? That's would be far more effective than tinkering with SEQR around the edges, in my opinion.
No question about it. No question about it. We saw that, and we talked to developers about that as well. Labor Law 240, by the way, is commonly known as the Scaffold Act, and we won't get too much into that because it's not really the topic here, but we have at the association been working with our federal elected officials on passing a bill through Congress and hopefully getting signed that would remove that from any federal funds that go to a state. So if that federal fund goes to the state and it makes it into one of these projects, that would be prohibited, the Scaffold Act. So we're working on that. And that really is a gravity-related injury, right? So anyone that falls on a work site, not to get too deep into it, and Andy knows better than I, it's really the fault, 100% fault of
absolute liability.
Absolute liability.
No defense.
Yeah. And so that drives insurance premiums like crazy and drives costs then to the project.
Correct. Yep.
And it's not just housing, it's in any municipal projects as well, why things are so expensive for municipalities. It's another one of those mandates. Everyone asks me about mandates, and we have to do maybe something on mandates, because It's not always just something that they pass. Sometimes it's in laws, sometimes it's in regulations. These mandates come from all over the place, but they're insidious because they're quiet.
They're hidden.
You don't
Correct.
see them directly necessarily.
Yep.
But boy, does it hit your financial situation.
Perfect example today. We're talking about the SEQR process, but we get to the scaffold law because what they're trying to achieve is more housing, but more housing can't be achieved just through tinkering with SEQR. There are all these other issues. And unfunded mandates drive the local costs, they drive the construction costs.
So we've talked about a lot, and we can talk about a lot more. And I
Sure.
think we have to do a part 2 or something. But I am going to say that there's another aspect of Let Them Build I want to talk a little bit about, and
Okay.
it's the streamlined timelines of the EIS. And so basically this is commonly known as a shot clock. So again, I think it's implied in this proposal that local governments use the process to slow things down. And what they want to do is put a 2-year shot clock on EIS, which I think, number one, you already said is such a small portion of projects. Right. So I think it's fair to have a shot clock, but I think we need to make sure we understand when best for that shot clock to start, because from my practical experience on my side of the table, a lot of times a developer would come in and they would really slow down the process themselves, because when you so let's talk a little bit about the EIS process and the scoping that goes on. So you start with scoping, and in that process, that gets bogged down because you and I will sit down as the town and the developer, and we'll try to figure out the questions, right? And you may not want to answer questions, or you may not think they're important, but we want them. And so that takes some time. And then you get the EIS, and then you say, okay, you go out, and you as a developer, you go answer those questions. Then you come back, and we may not get the answers we're looking for. You may not have answered them correctly. And let's talk a little bit about that and why the shot clock, when it starts, is actually important, because it has to be at a point when there's agreement that the questions have been determined and answered. Right. In my estimation.
And I agree with that. The EIS process is when there's a determination by the lead agency, what's called a positive declaration, which means there is a potential for at least one adverse environmental impact statement. And then the lead agency requires the preparation of an environmental impact statement. The scoping process, which is part of the SEQR process, is supposed to put everybody in a room and figure out what are the actual potential impacts. So you don't have to focus on stuff that isn't relevant. So visual impacts aren't going to be a problem. You don't have to analyze that and address that as part of your environmental impact statement. You can focus on the issues that are really at the heart of the matter. And then from the scoping process, it's up to the applicant to submit what's called a draft environmental impact statement. Here's our answer to all of your concerns. And here is our analysis, here's our conclusion, and here's any proposed mitigation that we would propose. The municipality then takes and reviews that. And then they comment on it. And it might be sufficient, it might be insufficient. And that's where the time comes in, because it's an interplay. The developer says, I answered all your questions. The municipality says, no, you really haven't. So that is where the time really lapses in the EIS process. I don't think you want a system where the municipality is under a time constraint to review that draft EIS. Once a draft EIS is accepted, if you want to create a shot clock to adapt the final environmental impact statement, I think that makes sense. But I don't think you want to handcuff the municipality, and because it's not a level playing field. The developer goes out and has the resources to hire all the engineers and architects and lawyers necessary, and then they come into this, what might be a small little town hall, and they dump a 3,200-page document on the desk of the town clerk and says, here's our draft EIS, start the clock. But that little municipality doesn't even have a town planner, a full-time town planner on staff. For the planning board to review that, planning boards meet twice a month, once a month. They're not full-time employees. They meet at night. They have day jobs. So who's going to review that 3,200 pages? So the municipalities are given the right to hire outside assistants, outside engineers, outside architects, outside lawyers to review that document. But that takes time. They have to interview the people, they have to bring them on board, then they have to get the document. The municipality shouldn't be forced to respond within a time frame at that point. Once they say, yes, we'll accept this as a draft EIS, then I think a time clock can start. But it's still got to be reasonable.
Right. And I think that's fair. And I think that what we're getting at here is some people may be implying that there's bad actors on the local side or there's bad actors in the developer, from the developer side. But really this is a complex system, process. It's important because these are things that are going to impact communities. And it is necessary for people to take the time and proper review of these projects to make sure that it's fitting the characteristics of the community. And one of the things I always look at the state of New York, it's hanging here with all the different municipalities carved out on my map here, 933 towns. We're very diverse. We're very diverse. What's right for Western New York is not right for Long Island, and what's right for Long Island is not right for the Adirondacks.
That's correct.
And so when we come in and we take policies like this and try to overlay it over a large state with many different regions and different considerations, it's a little bit too command and control-ish,
Yeah.
And so these are reasons why I think we need to slow down and look at this. Cut the red tape, as we said earlier. Give local governments more ability to move more efficiently, but also be respectful of the fact that these are important considerations local governments need to take.
So I had said I worked at the town of Babylon. When I was there, I think we had 7 full-time attorneys.
Wow.
We had a full-time town engineer that had his own staff.
Yep.
But that's Babylon. You go to the town of Allegheny, they may have a part-time town clerk, and that's it, and a planning board that meets once a month. So when that 3,200-page environmental impact statement comes in Babylon, there's staff in place to review it. When that comes in Allegheny, there's nobody. So that's the difference. You can't have a cookie-cutter approach across this state. And I don't think the state intends that to be the case. I think they want to be flexible. I know DEC does, but there are ways they could be flexible. Give the municipalities flexibility in the SEQR process. One example, the way the regulations are set up and the court cases that have interpreted it say that you can't designate a point person to be the lead agent, the lead agency. The lead agency has to be the board with the most underlying approval authority. Well, why? To me, that's completely unnecessary. Be flexible. There are some municipalities that have the resources and have a full-time town planner. Suburban towns, downstate towns, they have someone at least part-time, if not full-time. Give the town a flexibility to say, that's going to be he or she's going to be the lead agency for SEQR purposes. Now, require training and certification. Utilize the process that exists at the state level for code enforcement officers and building inspectors. They have to have sufficient training and then annual recertifications. Do that for a SEQR point person and give the municipalities the ability to say, that's our SEQR person. And now they're fully trained and certified, but it's taken the level of review away from the boards that may not necessarily have the wherewithal or the time to review it and puts it in a single location. It would be just as effective.
It's kind of like what they do with the MS4 officer.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Perfect example.
Designate somebody, train them, have them responsible for it.
And have them require mandatory certifications. That's not a problem. But put that person in charge of coordinating SEQR review. And then let that person make a recommendation back to the board. Let the board be the ultimate authority, but let the research, the legwork be done by a full-time staffer, a part-time staffer. We don't have that flexibility now. If it's a planning board application, the planning board has to be the lead agency. Those are the kind of tweaks that could be really effective because it just provides flexibility for the municipalities on the ground.
These are great proposals that we have here today, Andy. So this has been great. Do you have any other proposals?
Eliminate required publication requirements.
Oh my goodness, Andy, I should pay you for that one because we are pushing We are pushing hard, and there is no reason why the state still requires the 18th century practice of making sure that public notices get print in newspapers.
That's exactly what I'm saying. If you have a website, if you have a
Yes.
website that's available to the public at large, you should not be required to publish. Now, realistically, well, my personal opinion, it's the newspaper lobby that keeps that in place.
Oh, there's no question about it. We hit more people in our listserv than they hit.
So the notice is out there.
The notice is
Yeah.
out there, number one. Number two, the governor just signed not too long ago, and we agree that it was a great bill, the .gov mandate, where it says in that .gov mandate, A, you have to have a .gov website, which is appropriate, but two, you have to put your public notices on there. So the state's already requiring that on there. More people are going to go and look at your website than they're going to get a newspaper every morning to look at something. And the last thing I'll say on it, because I have a lot to say on it, but it's a double whammy as far as cost to the taxpayer, because the taxpayer has to pay first to have it published through the town, right? And that's expensive.
And then buy the paper.
But then they have to buy the paper to read it when they can get it free on the website. And so, that's a great proposal. We're with you. We're pushing that one. Actually, the bill has been introduced in the Assembly and in the Senate, so we're pushing that. I talked to the Town Clerks Association about it, and they are 100% behind it, because it's not just a costly mandate, efficiency for the work that the clerks have to do as well. It takes up a lot of time. But it does delay projects.
It does, absolutely. Yeah. And if something happens where you have a weekly as your official paper and it can't get published in time, then you lose a month on the application process because of it didn't get published. So now the project's out. It's actually 2 months, because you lose a month, you have to go back to the next one.
Yes.
Another tweak to the SEQR process that they should consider, which along those same lines. On type 1 actions, you have to notify any other potential lead agencies that you, the planning board, want to be lead agency. So anybody else that has any permitting or review authority, you have to notify them. They have 30 days to respond. Well, that 30-day time clock eliminates your ability to get back in for the next meeting for municipalities that meet once a month, which is the majority of them. So you already lose 2 months there, because if they declare lead agency in February, you can't get back in March because they're waiting for those responses, so you're now into April. You just lost 60 days. Shorten that. Make it 14 days. Make those agencies respond quickly if they have an interest, if they don't. In most instances, 99 out of 100, those responses come back and say, no, you're fine as lead agency. Please keep us involved, updated. But shorten that 30 to 14. That gives somebody the ability to apply in February and come in March and have the SEQR resolved, and possibly, for smaller projects, a decision in 1 month rather than at least 2.
Right.
Another example of the timing that can be changed.
I remember the frustration that things got delayed because of public notice, things got delayed because of clocks that had to expire. Yeah, and it was just awful. I felt terrible for the developer. And it's like, well, we can't get you on for another 60 days, another 2 months or something. That's awful. But I think these are great ideas. These are things that we have to work with you on and maybe help get over to the legislators and maybe the governor's office, because I think the governor's on the right track. I think the governor has a good idea and is trying to tackle an important issue. But I think we're just missing the mark a little bit. And maybe some of these other issues would have much greater impact on let them build. I say unshackle, okay, let them build, but I say unshackle local government. Right. And let local government do what it needs to do. And again, it goes back to the fact the things you're suggesting are very hidden, right? People they're silent. The public doesn't know that. I think sometimes a lot of folks in the state don't really recognize it or appreciate it. So these are all great ideas. I got to tell you, this has been very enlightening, very interesting. I think that we have a second podcast that we can do on, I've always wanted to get to the true cost of building in New York, because I think that needs to be addressed. So either you or one of your clients or anyone that you know would like to come back, love to talk about what it takes for a developer to build any project, but let's just say housing, because that's the crisis right now. And that would be an interesting podcast. So
There are some of my clients I wouldn't put on camera.
Yeah.
but-
we want it too
no,
unvarnished, right?
yeah, no, I'd be happy to do it. Happy to do it.
So we'll keep that in up is one of the opportunities coming up. Andy Brick has been with us. He's with the Brick Law Firm. Andy, if anyone wants to any of our towns want to talk to you, maybe get a hold of you for your expertise, hire you, whatever, how can they get a hold of you?
Sure, it's Brick Law Firm, and just email me, andy@bricklawfirm.com.
Oh, that's
One
very
word.
easy.
Bricklawfirm.com. Yeah.
And I love the name Brick and Let 'em Build. It all kind of connects, right?
It does. It does. And our office is located in the town of Colony,
Okay.
off of Wolf Road, in a gigantic brick building. And everyone asked me, "Did you plan that?" I said, "No, but I want to put my name on it."
Love the town of Colony. It's a great town. Thank you for being here. I really appreciate it. Thank you for listening. These are all important issues. This kind of goes with the OPEB issue, right, from last podcast. Maybe not necessarily things that are day to day in your mind or things that are household terminologies or anything like that, but certainly very important to communities, to where you live, to how we're going forward in the state together. And so thank you for joining us. As I said earlier, you can join us on YouTube, Spotify, Apple platform. Make sure you hit like, subscribe, and share. And as always, if you have any ideas that you want us to talk about, anything you're interested in hearing more about or us exploring, make sure you email us. You could always go to nytowns.org and email us there, or hit me at cketzle, Koetzle, @nytowns.org. Always looking forward to your comments. We've had some really good ones lately, so keep that coming. And again, thank you for joining us. And Andy, thank you for being here.
Oh, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.